Okay, so say we want to take this and utilize it in our Revit model. If we select the entire object and go to, I believe it's the exported, select objects to export, select it, and now it allows us to basically save it as a bunch of different file types. And so we could back save it to earlier versions of Rhino. We could save it as an Illustrator file, a DWG file, a DXF file. So both of these file types import to Revit as blocks. Where's this SAT file? Here's STL. We talked about 3D printing in Revit, exporting to an STL file. You can do it directly here. So if you wanted to print this thing in 3D for your model or something like that, or if it's another element that you've created that you want to print for your model in 3D, that's the file format to use.
The SAT was up.
Was it? Yeah, SAT. Nice. So I have this listed as the file type to import into Revit. I've never actually utilized an SAT file, but I would basically remember for Revit SAT, for AutoCAD DWG or DXF. And then if you are interested in 3ds Max and know how to utilize that software, it is 3ds, it should be somewhere in here. Right there, 3D Studio.3ds. Well, that didn't take as long as I thought it was going to. The other thing is make 2D. So I believe if we select the object, we can basically I just have the one object selected. Solid. Extract surface. Do you remember where the flatten tool is to break an object down into 2D elements? I forget where that's at. Well, there's the create a cage editing. Kind of curious about this as well. Alright, obviously I did not look at this closely enough. But at any rate, you can utilize cage points. I don't know how to use the cage tool, so I'm just not going to talk about it. How about that? Alright, so you can basically take an object and make it 2D. For laser printing, you could basically explode an object and I believe it's just make 2D. And so whatever you have selected, looks like it snaps right to the, I don't really like that. I found a better tool earlier and now I'm at a loss for where it is, which is unfortunate. So let's try this again. Make 2D. So if you needed to cut stuff out of the laser cutter in a 2D fashion, you can select certain objects. This is not a great example because it's a three-dimensional object, but say you were wanting to do a building, right? And start to take out the floors and the walls and cut them in the laser cutter, you could start to lay out your stuff in 2D form. And you could join those together, you know, once you do that. And then that's one object. And so you could just keep selecting objects and make 2D. Well, that was terrible. You have to be careful about how you do this, but it basically puts everything on those planes on one single axis plane, and then you can export that to AutoCAD and utilize that line work to create a laser cut file and cut that stuff out of the laser cutter. This is a bad example to show you, but that's pretty much how you do it. And I will search for a better way, because I know there is a better way, and maybe at the end of the course I'll retouch upon it when we're starting to talk about our final project. But at any rate, Make 2D is a useful tool to utilize for the laser cutter. So I'm just going to move some of this stuff off to the side so that we have a blank. We don't have to deal with these images. After you create your object, you can always just delete those images as well. But I think my task today is to kind of make a quick little scene so that this isn't just sitting in space, and then apply materials to pretty much everything. And that's really what I want to get at today, is how to do that. And maybe we want to apply materials to everything, but we'll just talk about the materials, some rendering tools, and how to change the camera lens and things like that. And so yeah, let's go ahead, and if you have the bottom of the stool created already, let's right click on the perspective view and come down here to set C-plane, and this allows us to reset the working plane, and we can set it to an object. And so I'm going to go ahead and utilize to an object, and I'm going to select the bottom of this curve, and as you'll notice, my grid then snaps to that. And so if you wanted to change your C-plane somewhere else on the object to make it easier to draw something, this is a good tool to understand how to use. And so sometimes you have to be careful about how you what angle you're looking at the object when you select it, because sometimes it can get confused and snap to something that you're not intending to. So it's best to kind of do it in a manner that allows you that there's nothing really behind the other object, so that you can snap to these different planes. So I'm going to reset it back to the bottom here. And I'm just going to create a rectangle corner to corner. Not really concerned about how big it is, but we could do maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. Sweet. I love how that draws it right on that seaplane. And we can utilize our move tool with our center snap on to snap to the bottom. I didn't get it. Of our chair, so it's centered. And then we can go ahead and draw a solid extrude planar curve to make a floor plate, and I'm going to type in -12 inches so that we have it going down instead of up. And of course there's still a little bit of space between there. Let's see if we got it here. Oh no, there's not. As you look at the right view, there's not a space there. It just looks like there's one in 3D, but there's really not. And then we can also create a surface from these edges and click enter and drag up a surface maybe 10 feet and repeat the command with the right click, enter, and we can snap to that. And so I'm starting to build a small scene here, right? And I don't know, maybe we'll just do the two sides so that we can kind of render this from different angles. But at this point you could start to start to draw polylines on. Of course there's not a mesh there, so let's see if we can add one. And we could draw where did that go? On mesh. Turn my ortho on because my snaps don't seem to be working. At any rate, I was hoping to basically draw some type of shape and then extrude that out to create some type of like framework for a shelving unit or something, but I'm not having much luck at the moment doing that. But you could always draw it outside of this shape and then move it in as well. So we could offset that by something small. I don't know. And then scale this thing down. Let's see here. Transform, scale. Always seem to be going off the grid here. But at any rate, you could see how quickly you could start to create a scene. Maybe that starts to become a bookshelf, taken with a little more care, maybe drawing the individual shelves first on that 2D line work before it gets extruded. At any rate, let's talk about materials. So under the Layers tab, there is a way to create a material for a specific layer here. And more or less, under the color, it gives you an area that you can open up a dialog box to go grab materials. And so if your doesn't go directly to the materials that come standard with Rhino, you can click on this More Types and go to this Load from File. And it comes with standard materials similar to Revit, but then you can also utilize a material from wherever you find one as well. So it's the same access point basically. So under your Rhino stuff, it comes with materials. Not all of them work very well. Well, that's a new one. Yeah? Okay. Let's double check the environment and see if that's the one that it wants to use. No. Okay. Well, fine. Be that way. So the other way to do a material is by object. And so if you select the object and you're on the Properties dialog box, you have Materials, Texture, Mapping, and also Decals. So if we select the material option, it says assign a material by layer, by parent, or by object. If we select object, we basically come to the same dialog box, and this should let us, oh, quit messing with me today. I was just doing this last night. Yeah. So I just grabbed a material in my material library, but I'm going to add a new material. Adding new materials allows us to go to the rendered content. And so, like, let's look at grass. Sort of looks real, but not really. Maybe that wants to be applied. To our floor. It's kind of a better grass than Revit gives, which is interesting, but it's still kind of 2D. But at any rate, let's create a new material. And let's utilize a wood texture here. Maybe some oak flooring. I don't know. Where's the... That's starting to put... So we could rename the material, but if you utilize the materials that that they come standard out of the box, they pre-label them for you, so you know what materials what. If you don't, you can rename a material. What the hell? There we go. By right-clicking on the name, but it appears like you have to have it selected first to rename that. So this guy basically reduces the opacity on it, but it doesn't actually make it transparent. So what is that, the fill color or something like that? Not opacity itself. You can apply glossy finishes to it to make it more glossy or reflective, or even transparent. And you can pick a base color to go underneath that. If you select on the basically when you first click on an empty, it goes directly to pick a material through your library or through your file management system. But once you have a material picked, it brings up a dialog box here where you can then reselect a different material if you wanted to. The mapping of the material, so if we wanted to make this smaller, this number gets bigger, I'm pretty sure. And click OK, and you see that we have a lot more of this material. If you want to make it bigger, it actually goes in the opposite direction of what you would think you would want. And then you can also change the environment mapping, which doesn't do a whole lot. Where is the... sorry. So under texture mapping, if you have your object selected, you can apply a different type of surface pattern. So spherical. You can see that got really blurry. But you can change that to planar. And you just kind of got to play around with these to get it to be what you want. And planar in most UVW makes the most sense. And this is where you can start to change where it sits, the repeat pattern, the offset pattern. So if we were to change this to 12 and lock, let's see. I don't know. Just play around with this a little bit. Rotating these. Let's see. Doesn't really want to do anything here. Oh yeah, be careful about that one. That changes the camera view. So I think it's best to probably leave some of this stuff alone unless you're making your computer go crazy. And 0. But in order for this stuff to pop up, you have to have a material selected or an object selected. So right now the properties, if I don't have anything selected, it goes to the viewport, which is the perspective view. And so this is where you can change your lens length. So what is it, 28 millimeter is kind of a standard camera lens length. And we could change that to a 2-point perspective view versus parallel or just plain perspective. So if you were looking to do a 2-point perspective, maybe you're in Matt Brame's section and he wants you to do everything by hand drafting. If you modeled it, printed it out, you know, you could do a 2-point perspective fairly easily by tracing over the object. These X, Y, and Z more or less change as you scroll in and out and rotate around, because it's basically saying where is the camera located in space relative to the center point. Kind of curious about this one. That's interesting. So the wallpaper, you can put a background image in, right? In the background. Not sure if that's necessarily something that should be utilized, but you can more or less do that. if we go to our rendering tools up here, we can start to affect the sun. So if we select on the sun, right now there isn't a sun on, but if we turned it on, it starts to give us a gazillion options here. It's not somewhat intuitive, but not really. So you can change the north angle. You can change the date and time. This is the month, and this is the day itself. You can manually pick your location by selecting. There's a little red dot here. I don't know if you can see it very well, but you can manually pick it. And then down here at the bottom, you can actually go in and select a specific place. So Boise, Idaho, for instance, is in there. Moscow's not in here. I tried to look it up. If you wanted to find a place, you'd type it in here and it would start to appear if it was in their database. You can also do by latitude and longitude. And then you can change your time zone. So if we have our manual controls on, it basically asks you to put in your altitude and your azimuth. I can't pronounce that, but basically that angle, I believe, is talking about between 90 and 90 here. And then the altitude is the angle hold on a second. If we change this to 120, yeah, I have that backwards. So this is kind of depicting the azimuth, which is where is it in the sky, east to west, right, in this orientation. And then the altitude is what's the angle that it's at. So 23 degrees kind of depicts somewhere in January. And if we change that to 60 degrees, now we're talking about mid-June, somewhere in there. So you can change it manually as well. So if you want to look up the specific sun angles for Moscow, you could type those in, or you could try to do it manually through here as well. So lights right now, the only lights that appear are the sun and the skylight, which is basically just an overall light setting. But as you can see that by turning those on, it actually starts to produce ambient light. You can also pick the ground plane, turning that on and using a specific material as the ground plane itself. This actually has way more options than the previous version. But it works similar to a material, right? So we have all of our materials in here. For instance, I just chose the grass material. And you can see that now we just have a flat grass plane that basically goes on forever. And there's a horizontal horizon line here. And that changes that line based upon how scrolled in you are. So as we change this, you can see the shadow pattern starting to change here. Whoops, what just happened? I put that in my dialogue here, didn't I? So it appears like you can add these tabs up here. I just basically dragged it over and it automatically snapped. You could also close out of that. Turn it back on. And adjust these a bit so it doesn't have to be blocking the entire screen. Yikes. I'm doing all sorts of crazy stuff right now. Don't do what I'm doing. Where'd my sun go? Put it back with my lights and ground plane. And I want to add it. There we go. Okay, stop playing around. Try to teach you something. The other thing we can do is we can start to place other lights. So if we turned our sun off, right, we're back to kind of our generic light. I'm also going to turn off ground planes. I'm not really liking that. We can start to place different types of light. So we can create a spotlight, point light, directional light, rectangular light, and so you have a lot of different options as far as lighting goes. If you just start placing lights, like that's just a sphere of light. You can kind of do this manually. You can create a secondary light, maybe get two shadows on the object. Create an additional third one. I don't know, maybe you're doing some type of stadium and you're wanting that kind of look, but as you add more lights it gets brighter and brighter, and so you want to be careful about that as well. And then as far as the materials, depending on how you set up your material and whether it has, you know, a glossy finish or reflectivity to it, is going to affect your render and how that's going to turn out. So it seems a little bright to me, and maybe we want to create a new material by object, and maybe we want to do some type of metal and do like a silver. And then these buttons are your renders, and so render settings, if my computer does not glitch out, brings us back to our document properties, and this is where you can set up the resolution of your image. So you know, we can change this to 300 dpi, so that's basically pixels per inch, or dot pixels per inch. We could change this to inches, and you can see that by utilizing these and then changing the pixels per inch makes the image larger or smaller depending on the resolution size. So it's just basically taking that 920 and dividing it by 150 to get one of those two numbers. Can also change the background environment here. So if we want a gradient or a solid color, you can start to manipulate that as well here. Or again, turning on wallpaper, stretching to fit. So you have a bunch of options here. What time is this class over again?
2:45.
I keep forgetting that. And then this is the precision, right? So the higher this is set, probably the longer it's going to take to render. And so what it's rendering is the perspective viewport. So if we clicked render, still have that background image in there. But at any rate, that didn't take very long to render. You can start changing the exposure. And there's different effects that you can put on the render. Really haven't explored much of these, but the options are here to do that. You can start to affect the RGB. So obviously if you have all three clicked, you'll see it, the render pretty normal, but as you just utilize the reds or the greens or the blues, and see how that changes. And then you could set this default here, but I probably don't want to do that. And so these are kind of similar options to photoshopping, so I'm not real sure why they included this stuff in here, because you could just drop this image into Photoshop and do a lot of these things a lot easier. And then you just go to File, so you can clone the window and shoot it off to the side. Maybe you don't like the image that's rendered, but you have a start point here. And so you can start making adjustments and then re-render and compare the two, see what you did differently to make the render look different. We could obviously save the image. It's kind of similar to 3ds Max in that respect, where you can clone the window, make changes, re-render. It's kind of interesting like that. But that's a fairly basic outlook on materials and the rendering capabilities of this software, and I would explore more on that. So those lights that we put in, they pop up under lights. You can choose to turn them off, turn back on the skylight or the sun, and you can see the sun starts to put ambient shadows as well in here, whereas these lights don't really do that as well. They put some shadow, but it's not, there's a little bit of ambient in here, but you'd want to see more ambient shadow kind of in the nooks and crannies. But again, those are things that you can touch up in Photoshop, so it's not super important. Just kind of drawing other light sources, so utilizing the spotlight. You can see that puts kind of a spotlight effect. Whoops, Control Z that. We could effectively put a spotlight on our object. Doesn't really look that great though, because you'd think you'd see a different shadow in there. So it could be that this light, yeah, I don't really like the spotlight. Direct light. Start to turn off some of these other kind of acts more like a sun in a lot of ways. I think this was kind of the old sun tool, but they've left it in there. It's not as easy to use, obviously, as the sun would be.
The real sun.
The real sun. Rectangular light. As you can see, as I drop these lights in here, they all kind of appear. And again, these are directional lights. I don't know where that came in at. I think it's down here at the bottom. Yeah. Not so sure about that one either. Kind of locking in weird areas. But at any rate, you can see the different types of lights that you can start to create to render your scene out, which you will want to kind of look more into this a bit, because the final assignment will ask you to render out a view or two and Photoshop it. So next week, or on Thursday, we'll jump into Photoshop and start looking at that. Yeah, so that pretty much concludes Rhino for the moment. We'll probably touch back on it at the very start of the final assignment to just kind of remind you guys of the different types of tools you can utilize and the rendering capabilities of the software. But let's just kind of open up the rest of the time to finish up assignment 1. If you guys have any questions about that and modeling strategies, please don't hesitate to ask either one of us. Go ahead and pause the video.